As I had assumed, that nationwide release of 8th grade did not in fact come through here, but we did still manage to get a couple, so there is that. One wide release and then one like digital release, so there is that. And then like next week is supposedly a nationwide release of Black Klansman. We'll see if that happens for us or not. But in the meantime, we do have these two. So let's start with Christopher Robin, which, interestingly enough, is by Mark Forster, who did a number of things completely unrelated, like Monsters Ball or Quantum of Solace. But he's reuniting with Ewan McGregor after they did Stay Together to do this. And he also did Finding Neverland, which actually does make sense. So this is what's really interesting is obviously it's like a fictional character, unlike we handled in Finding Neverland. But the thing here is that it's also got a bit of Hook in it as well. So it's like they just took every possible like Peter Pan story they could think of, and it's like, hey, let's just do that only with Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh. So we do have that where the whole storyline of Christopher Robin eventually grows up, becomes a little too much of an adult, and forgets what it's like to have fun like he did in his youth, and so they come back and they help him. It's a very similar setup, unlike the backstory of the author that we got in Finding Neverland, which I guess we technically got that with Goodbye Christopher Robin with Donald Gleason, but nobody wants to remember that. So, starting off, I had heard that people weren't quite sure about how this was going to go down with the mixing live action and the CGI animation, but then people started making the comparisons to like Paddington, and there is definitely something to be had there. Not like necessarily like it's going to be as creative and over the top as Paddington, but just sort of, I guess the style of animation more or less. And they do this genius thing where not only does it look like Pooh and his friends are actually there, but they actually look like stuffed animals. That are living. Like, they didn't try to do, like, the Smurfs thing or anything like that. They didn't try to make them look like when they're actually animated or whatever. They actually made it look like stuffed animals had come to life, and and the effects are, like, insanely good. Like I was almost like I was actually starting to look for flaws in the animation, and it's like, it's just so incredibly seamless there, and that's really well done. And they do have some interesting setups to how exactly they're going to tell this story. Like they have, like when they did the chapters thing at the start, where they do this really clever thing where they show us, like you would be seeing in one of the Winnie the Pooh books, the chapters that Christopher Robin went through as he grew up and eventually got to the point that he did now. Because when the first chapter came up, I initially thought that's how they were going to do the movie. But that it's just this clever opening title sequence that shows us exactly what happened when he grew up and how he got to be sort of the shut-off way that he is with the whole his father's death and the boarding school and stuff like that. Or the boring school, as Pooh lovingly calls it. And of course, a lot of this is going to count on Ewan McGregor's commitment to this character and the fact that he's got to spend most of the movie talking to things that aren't actually there, or things that are supposed to be living, talking, stuffed animals, and he obviously does this very well throughout. There's only so many actors that would have been able to snatch Pooh away from that kid in the stroller and say, you don't just take a teddy bear from a grown man and make it totally convincing and funny at the same time. The more convincing it is, the funnier it is. Um, and just throughout that, but it's also like the whole sort of distant sadness in him, or the scenes where he sees Pooh again for the first time, and like it starts to kind of come back to him. All these things here that are absolutely crucial to this character and his portrayal that McGregor's able to do just perfectly. So that's really good. And then of course they do throw in some stuff there to where it's like, how do you combine these things? Or like Paddington backed itself up with the brilliant joke and setup where everybody knew Paddington was a talking bear, but just nobody really cared, which is great. So they obviously can't repeat that joke. So they've got to go with they do have to in fact try to keep quiet and not talk in public because people will freak out. and this does happen. And I like that it did happen. Like, people do freak out when they hear them talk or see them move, but it's not that over the top about it, which would have taken the movie probably into like full on slapstick. But it is like it's as downplayed as Paddington, but they do react. Which I do really like, and the way they handle some of these things, like exactly how Pooh gets to London by just going through this deserted area and then sort of just walking in. And when he tries to explain this to Christopher Robin just says, that's a silly explanation, and Pooh thanks him. And it's like, yeah, come to think of it, that is all we need. And it is in sort of the true fashion here, that's how we explain, or more so not explain, exactly how this happened. And it's like, when you realize what you're looking at with all the talking animals and all that, it's like, yeah, we don't really need explanation. Like, it's magic, okay? That's all that matters. And it does have moments where I had heard going in that there was like a definite sadness to it, like sort of like the ending of Toy Story 3, that kind of thing. It's expected given the kind of story that we're telling. So what I actually found really interesting was I was kind of expecting something like really overblown sad, like right in your face, like desperately trying to physically pull the tears out of your eyes sort of way. But it's not really that. It just kind of, it's sad because it is what it is, and it doesn't really try to add anything to the scenario to really blow it up to try to get something out of the audience. It just kind of stays what it is, and that's just what's sad about it in general. They don't need to really add anything to it or try to amp up the emotion in itself. Just kind of let it be what it is, and it accomplishes that. Which I really appreciate. And there's even those moments that are sad, but also kind of subtle, like when he's obviously Christopher Robin's doing the business dad cliche now, so he's got to neglect the family and all that, always disappoint his daughter. But when she gets sad that he has to cancel a trip for work, she doesn't she blows up later, but she doesn't blow up at this point. But she is really let down and really disappointed. And it's just like, you almost have to squint to see it, the one tear that comes down her face. But she's like hardly crying at all, but it's because it's just so sort of small like that, makes it even sadder than if she had like a full-on blow-up or something, which is great. And kind of in that same scene, where we see that the youthful Christopher Robin is still in there, but the way we actually get to see him like suppress it in the moment, when she finds acorns. And it's the way he sees it. He says it like quietly, but you can see like something lights up in him when he sees this acorn. And then we actually see him like extinguish that in him. And he just says that's no big deal and goes back into boring adult mode or whatever. The stuff like that, the emotional stuff like that was handled really well. And then, of course, the Pooh and his friends, I do think that there is... We probably could have used more of the others, like Rabbit and Owl and Piglet and all them, Kanga and Roo, because we spend a lot of time... Obviously, Pooh makes sense, that we get him throughout most of the movie, but then the next one he meets in the forest is Eeyore, and then it's kind of just Eeyore for a little bit, and then eventually the rest of them are in a group. I suppose I kind of get it, but at the same time, it's like... Eeyore's kind of the character that is like one joke, so it seems kind of odd that of all the others besides Pooh, he's going to be the one that gets the most screen time. But maybe because his personality trait is the most recognizable of the group, but I don't know, I feel like they kind of overplayed that a little bit and kind of really, really stretched that out. Like by the sixth time or so, that he says, like, oh, it was a disaster, I'm surprised I wasn't invited. It's kind of run its course. And the others are just kind of all grouped together, which is a shame because you do have, like, a really great, convincing voice cast here. Obviously, you have the legendary Jim Cummings, but then you also have, like, Brad Garrett obviously does Eeyore very well. You can tell it's pretty much just him doing a Peter Cullen impression, but it's still definitely there. But then you have this really great casting, like Peter Capaldi as Rabbit and Toby Jones as Owl. but they have like 3 lines each, which feels like such a waste. So that was kind of unfortunate. I felt like we should have had kind of more of all of them together the way we do, but they were either split up most of the time or we were focusing on something else. And that probably could have brought a bit more magic if they were in it just a bit more. I wouldn't like say make them throughout, because then, like Eeyore, it would wear itself out. They all probably would eventually, but yeah. And then they go into the whole, we do have like some adventure scenes like that, but I do like that, like I was talking about how it seems to just barely avoid slaps. Sure, there's some stuff where they get thrown around, or Eeyore gets catapulted, or they hit a windshield or something, but overall, the like action, if you want to call it that, it does feel very like small for a children's movie, which is nice because it does feel like totally reined in like the rest of the movie does, and it sort of is able to stay within its own tone with that, while also making, like just, you know, fun, frantic scenes, mainly for children and stuff like that, so that works too. And speaking of entertaining children, it was very interesting, because you can kind of tell the pacing for this movie, where we got to go through the whole thing where he grows up, where he's all businessy, where he's neglecting the family and all that, and that being the beginning, when we're away from the animated characters. And I went in at noon, and this theater was full. There, like, the seat next to me was, like, the only empty one in there, and we were in the biggest auditorium in the theater. So it was really interesting to see firsthand how kids would react to this, and if they had the patience for some of that build-up or whatever, or the scenes that weren't as... just the scenes without the animated characters, basically. I could sense some restlessness occasionally, but it was more like... it was from, like, 4-year-olds, so no matter what was going on, there was probably going to be a restlessness there anyway. So I do think they do a great job in regards to making sure they keep kids entertained also, because they do introduce Pooh pretty quickly once we've gone through what Christopher Robin's doing now. As a kid, it might seem like maybe an eternity before we get to that point, but in actuality, it's probably maybe the first 15 minutes or so, which is actually pretty perfect, so there's that. And they do... I mean, every now and then there are scenes where it's like, it's something very played out. Like the business dad cliche is kind of played out. But then there's also, like, this is the kind of movie where the one that Christopher Robin has to, like, stand up to in his workplace is a very stuffy guy, actually named Giles, with an exaggerated accent and just way about him. It's that kind of thing. It's like the antagonists in the real life version, like real life parts of Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland. It's like that, but thankfully that's brief, so it doesn't matter too much. And obviously it can be very, very funny. There's one hysterical scene, the whole train station thing, when he has to, because people do react to the animal speaking, he has to try to walk through a very crowded train station while keeping Pooh quiet when all Pooh wants to do is talk to everybody he sees. And then obviously eventually loses him. And all the whole interaction with Pooh, you would think it sort of comes off like those like old comedies where it's a guy and a kid that get into like predictable situations and the kid is annoying the dude and all that. Only instead of a kid, it's Winnie the Pooh. And it's actually, it's a lot funnier than, say, that, typical situation in a movie like this would probably lead you to believe. So that was really nice. And obviously, eventually, it is going to turn into a message maybe about, what's really important and, family or business and being unappreciated there where you are and being appreciated where you're not. And it's... yeah, so, but even so, its heart is definitely here. There's some interesting things in the way it's told, like, technically. Like, for some reason, there's a few, like, Terrence Malick shots in this, like, when they're in the field and Pooh's, like, running his hand across. It's almost like they're intentionally, like, evoking Malick or something, which is really bizarre. And then, like, the shot with, like, the balloon hanging out of the train, stuff like that. There were also some parts where it's like, a lot of it's like foggy, a lot of it is like the sun hitting the lens or whatever. It also kind of gave the vibe of like, when you get an artsy director to do something sort of out of his wheelhouse, like when David Lowery did the remake of Pete's Dragon, this feels a lot like that too, which I did really like that. So that's here. But Forster isn't even like all that art house. Like the closest he probably came was Monsters Ball. So that's interesting to see him tell the story this way. If there's one problem this movie has, if you just want to go into technical stuff real quick, it's got an editing problem quite a bit. Like, the pacing itself is fine, but some of the individual scenes feel a bit too, like, the editing's a bit overzealous, and there's a lot of cutting for no particular reason. Maybe I can understand the scene when it's building up to when he and Pooh are about to run into each other, but it still feels a bit overly cut. But then there's, like, they'll just be in, like, the luggage office or something, and it'll just seem, like, way too... Like, it's trying to be a little too frantic when there's literally nothing happening. It's like, maybe that was, like, the studio behind the editor saying, like, we've got to... a bunch of kids are going to come to this movie, we got to make it seem like something's happening even when it's just, business stuff or whatever. But that can be a bit... Yeah, and on the train, when he's, like, trying to work and Pooh is there... just these weird close-ups of him just rapidly cutting while he's... It's a little weird, but obviously these are just individual scenes. The whole movie does not adopt this, style, so that's just a little something. So yes, the main point being that it is funny and it is charming, and the character personalities are still there, if maybe not as much as some of them should be. There should be a little more of those other characters, but then overall, when it comes down to it, and it comes down to its message of what's really important and all that, even if we've seen that a million times before, the ending is still very effective and very heartwarming and all that. I know when movies like this come out, especially from Disney, there'll be a lot of people really quick to say, like, oh, it's this big, corporate movie, and they're just using, the property that's already popular as a cash cow and stuff like that, and it's soulless or something like that. There's clearly... I mean, when you look at the writing, you've got Alex Ross Perry, who's, big on the indie scene. Tom McCarthy. There is something legitimate here, and your wannabe cynicism is not going to bring it down as much as you want it to. So that's really what we have here. It's perfectly fine. It's probably exactly as you expect it to be, and that's not really a problem. And it's the fact that it hits those emotions that it's going for is what's important, and that it does it very well. So, yes. And of course, McGregor's performance at the heart of it to really bring it to life in a big way. So, yes. So that's what that is. Let's go on now to First Reformed, which was a movie I've been getting hyped for a while. With it being Paul Schrader's new outing with Ethan Hawke. And obviously anything pretty much related to Ethan Hawke I will get excited about, because not only is he, like, just a really interesting actor and taking on really interesting projects, but just when you watch him, especially when he was out promoting this, he's always just somebody really fascinating to listen to when they just talk about the craft in general. And you can just tell he has such a love and a passion for it. So, these two combined together, I think, like most people probably, it can be half and half when it comes to Schrader. I think that his filmography is just so diverse, I think there's really no other way it can be. I don't know that I've ever met anybody that likes Schrader, like, 100%. But, yeah, I was still very much interested in this, though, to see where this would come together. Starting off with Hawke as this priest that's writing in this diary and basically telling us that he's gonna write down the truth, and basically this whole narration that goes throughout the whole movie. And when it comes to a year, he is going to have this journal destroyed for whatever reason. And we learn things about him pretty quickly, and some of them may seem more important than others. Like, for instance, his clearly declining health. He spends, like, a number of horrible nights in the bathroom, and then there's just the detail that he has this... He communicates through text, but it's, like, through this very old-looking flip phone. And we're not quite sure how he ever came into possession of, but then, he eventually meets Amanda Seyfried, who is troubled by her husband, and then that's you pretty much just want to leave it at that when you describe what it's about, because really the plot per se doesn't really have a whole lot to do with what we're looking at. This is definitely very strictly a character thing, and despite my hype going into it, there was one thing that was kind of holding me back a little bit, and that was the fact that obviously, clearly, Schrader's big influence going into this was Bresson's Diary of a Country Priest. And while I like Bresson quite a bit, with Pickpocket being a personal favorite on top of, A Man Escaped and Balthazar, just the greatest hits of him, Diary of a Country Priest wasn't one of my favorites that he did. I guess I just wasn't into it. It's one of the, I think, less memorable ones, to me anyway, that he put out. But I mean, obviously, from the start, if you just look at the Hawk character for like 30 seconds, you can just see that influence from this movie. But the thing, when I started watching it, that kind of calmed me down a little bit and made it feel a bit like, okay, I probably can still get into this, is that it started to me to feel more like, I was getting more of a vibe of like Winter Light, the Bergman movie, just in color. And once I kind of got into that, it was like, I have no idea if that had anything to do with his influence at all. I don't know if he's ever said anything like that. But I was kind of leaning more towards that than more Diary of a Country Priest, despite the fact that so clearly, I mean, this could almost maybe technically be considered a remake to a certain extent. But yeah, it was very easy after a while to get very, very engrossed in, and we do have the supporting characters that sort of come and go, mainly the Seyfried character and the pastor at the bigger church next door that's run by Cedric the Entertainer. Going by his real name, Cedric Isles, in the cast list, in the credits. So, they were going to try to go for something serious. I think this... I don't recall him being credited by his real name up until this point. If he was, it was probably something very small, but... Yeah, and he does... It's weird how much he doesn't stick out in the way you might think. The change in the credits actually might have a lot to do with that. But, still, yeah, everything seems to fit nicely here, particularly in this cast, even though it does more or less eventually feel like a one-man show with Hawk, of course. Where it's one of the interesting things about all the characters really, but mainly Hawk, and that is that it's pretty much impossible to not try to study his every move, especially with the way they're shot. Where there's a lot of, typically you would see, like, if there's a conversation scene or something and there's kind of like the side shot, or we're kind of getting back and forth shots or whatever, but there's a lot of shots in this movie to where the camera is almost like confronting its characters, and it's like right here with just the chest up being in, they're like 80% of the shot. We still occasionally get those shots, from like a distance or from the side or whatever, but there's a lot of these shots going on. And like I said, it really just kind of helps in feeling like not only that these characters are just being confronted by it, but it makes it easier to sort of just try to look in, because it can be easy to get like distracted or whatever, but like if you're not quite sure where the very thin story is going to go, and that might be where your mind is at. It feels like the way this movie was shot, that there was almost an intention to make us look for the little things and not just sort of, even though it is something that you'll want to go, probably see again at least a couple more times, it is like, usually you have to do that and you kind of rely on yourself to just see it the first time and then catch the details later, but this almost seems to confront you to look for the details right now. At least that's how I felt the way it was shot, and the way it's just presented in general. And obviously Hawk is great with doing this. It's clear Schrader's kind of going back to that territory, with like the self-destructive loner, where he had his trilogy of Travis Bickle, and then there was Richard Gere in American Gigolo, and then Willem Dafoe in Light Sleeper. And he does definitely fit into those, and there's something that he really carries that's obviously very downplayed, but at the same time that it's downplayed, there is something like really almost cruel about it. And there is something to where you feel like he's very open to helping, he's very soft-spoken and all that. But then later, when he snaps at somebody, it's still relatively downplayed, but also very jarring, just quite suddenly. But at the same time, as jarring as it feels to witness it, once it's happened, it doesn't feel that surprising. Uh, because of the way this character has kind of slowly been built up to. Um, and because there's also this whole thing of, I guess in true Schrader fashion, you would think, given the subject matter, it would be a movie that's sort of focused on like a spiritual experience kind of thing. But of course, Schrader has this way of showing the world in like a really unrelenting and bleak way. And there's like most notably probably would be his latest movie with Willem Dafoe, Dog Eat Dog. It just really shows how just really dark and bleaking. Obviously, Taxi Driver and all that, and Light Sleeper kind of got into those really underground areas also. But and just there's the whole middle ground too. Like obviously he did like the canyons and all that other stuff. But still, um, he doesn't stray away from that. Even so, even in this subject matter, and it doesn't feel like when it kind of starts to go in that direction. In a lesser made movie, it probably would have been felt like very sudden that it goes in the dark directions that it does. But there's just something under the skin of this movie to where we do feel like we're getting to that point. Obviously, it's, there's a very bleak event in like the first 20 minutes, but even so throughout, there's this score that's happening that's just like really dark and really dooming sounding. And it seems to kind of come in scenes that don't necessarily call for it. But there is a certain, that feeling is in there kind of throughout. Even if it does seem to just kind of pop up, even when it's not necessary, it probably is necessary. You just kind of have to trust them. And then when it gets to the point that it does, one of the final scenes, it's sort of like, you do feel like you gradually got there, even if somebody was just watching it on the surface. And that's the thing about that score, is it's not there very often, but it does make all the difference to the point that it's probably plays a massive part than even it seems in regards to getting that tone to where it goes and keeping it feeling steady throughout. Where if we took that just little music that just comes in occasionally out entirely, it would probably feel like we made a huge leap. But because of that just little addition, it feels like we gradually got to where we were going. Once again, this is just the way I see it, though. There is, obviously, it eventually takes the turn into the environmental stuff, and it doesn't really say, and there's a lot of dialogue in regards to the environmental stuff and how it's basically, we're basically basically making the planet eat itself and stuff like that. But there's nothing particularly revelatory about the dialogue and the way they do this. It's very much like if you've ever looked at like an online discussion about environmental topics or or like environmental lectures or something, this dialogue is not going to be anything you haven't heard before multiple times over. But as far as like you sort of kind of start to see it as like the way he sees it and all these visions that he has of just all this garbage and this dirtiness, and he's looking at all the stuff that's like coming, like the reefs and all that just coming apart and all that. It is sort of like, I guess it's an allegory for for his like own declining health. Like he actually, what's happening to the Earth, he's sort of being confronted by that already because it's what's happening to him, like his actual body, I suppose. Which drives him even more in regards to, as his health declines, the more sort of he's driven to, sort of like the decline we see in Travis Bickle, only without the ailments, just heading in that direction that we know is bad news, and it just keeps going and going closer and closer into that direction until we eventually get somewhere. But there is something also about it, though, that feels like, and yeah, on top of stuff that might seem blatant, there is some of that stuff, like the fact that Amanda Seyfried's playing a pregnant woman named Mary. I know, yeah. But, still, there's something about this movie that really struck me. And it's not just, the character work, it's not just the performances, it's not just what Schrader's pulling off and the writing or, his depiction of it in general. But what I thought was really interesting about it, and maybe it's the aspect ratio thing going on too, um, it's a movie that feels older than it is, even older than his flip phone, his flip phone, for instance, to where it feels like I don't know how many people like it, started exploring art movies through like the Criterion Collection or through like Turner Classic Movies or something. Or most recently, the Filmstruck streaming service, which is amazing. And it feels like when you explore movies like that and you just kind of go down those rabbit holes and see what you can find, what sort of movies just kind of fell off the face of the earth but are actually like these things that are like treasured by the people that really go and look for them. This feels like a movie you would find doing that. That's from like maybe the 90s or something, to where it was like this, really beloved thing, but then it just kind of disappeared into obscurity, and then you just dig it up looking for other like sort of art house type movies. Um, I'm not quite sure how I can describe why it feels like that. But yeah, it's just in general, it's just kind of this thing that feels a bit older than it is. Um, and that's, yeah, so I just found that feel really interesting too. Like, it's kind of hard to describe. I wish I could describe it better, but that's all I can really take from it. And then, lastly, there's the ending. I don't know, this is gonna go nowhere, I'm just telling you now. I don't know how I feel about I just saw it, so I really don't know how I feel about that ending yet. But I'm kind of glad, because I feel like it's not an ending you can take something from directly, immediately. So I am interested to see how, as time goes on, and the more I think about that, where exactly I end up on that. But right now it does feel like too soon to say, but yeah, I'm really not quite sure about the ending, but time will tell. Maybe this will like make a list at the end of the year or something, and I'll be able to figure out what I feel about it by then. But for the most part, yeah, and that's good too, to do this whole, because sometimes it can be damaging to a movie to do it this way, to where you immediately see it, then you immediately talk about it as if it's, because I do my best to not talk like what I'm saying right now is a definitive opinion that I have. I think I've shown that plenty of times over the years already, but so yeah, but this is how I'm just kind of feeling going into this right now. I don't know if this was insightful in any way whatsoever, or says anything that nobody else has said about it, but yeah, so that's what we have here. Next week, I might do this big old catch-up thing where there's sort of the videos where I do like, 12 or 15 or whatever, and we'll see what comes along for those. So I have like a nice whole lineup I can get to, so we'll see what happens with that, and yeah. So, and then Versus will do whatever it is. After the Marvel one, I'm really not quite sure where I'm going, but we'll figure it out. So, yeah, until all that stuff,